So I'm here to introduce to you Tyler Moore, who comes from the computer laboratory of the University of Cambridge, works with Ross Anderson. And the title of the talk is The Economics of Information Security, so a very important and interesting topic. And thanks, Tyler, for speaking to us about this.
Thanks, Stefano. Actually, having just heard Stefano's talk, I think it's quite nice. It serves as a quite nice motivation for what I'm going to be speaking about, because when he mentioned that, that as security consultants, we push out these predictions for what attackers are going to do in the future, and we may be very good at doing technical work. We can study what a technical vulnerability is, but if we don't understand the underlying motivations and incentives for why the attackers behave in the way that they do, we get it spectacularly wrong. And as it turns out, fairly simple economic analysis can provide a lot of very valuable and correct insight into what's going on in information security. So first, I'm just going to start with an overview of some of the key results in this area of in economics of security, and then I'll go into a couple particular examples. And finally, on the last half of the talk, I'll kind of go serve as a case study in some of the research that I've been doing, looking at phishing attacks in particular, and studying the interaction between those who are carrying out the attacks and the different organizations responsible for defending against these attacks. All right, so over the past few years, we've started to apply economic analysis to information security, and it turns out that this works a lot better than technical analysis alone. And you've also got firms which are using security mechanisms to further their own business aims, which is okay, but as long as this is happening, we need to think economically to explain why the security mechanisms are being used in this fashion. And sort of one of the big problems is that we don't have a lot of access to good comparable information. We may have a lot of data, but it's loaded with biases, like Stefano was talking about. And so we need better information to improve the allocation of resources to defending our computer systems. So back in the day, people used to think that the internet was insecure because we just didn't have enough features. We just don't have quite the right technical protocols designed, so we don't have the right authentication mechanisms in place. We need two-factor authentication, no mutual authentication. All these, if we can just get this new technical solution pushed out, all our problems will be solved. So we worked on, we've provided better solutions, AES, PKI, the list goes on. And so, but really, no matter what we do, there are more new, better secure protocols that keep coming out, but no one is claiming that the world is getting any more secure on the internet. So when you take a step back and look at sort of the incentives that are in place, it kind of explains things quite nicely. So the first classic example, my supervisor came up with about 10 years back. He looked at the fraud incidences of on ATMs in the UK and compared that to the US. And what he found is that surprisingly in the UK they were suffering much higher levels of fraud than in the US. But he also noticed that in the UK, banks were originally less liable to fraud. The onus was on the consumer to prove that they were not responsible for the fraud. So as a result, they ended up becoming careless, and they ended up spending more money and suffering more fraud. You have these distributed denial of service attacks, where you have malware that gets installed and it's not really concerned about affecting the computer that it uses. It just wants to use that compromised machine as a vector for launching a further attack. And then you have this question: is why is Microsoft software insecure, and despite its market dominance, shouldn't the most secure, best product be the one which wins in the market? But when you think about incentives, These systems are often secure because the people who could fix them don't have the right incentive to do so. It's the bank customers who suffer when you have poorly designed banking systems that make fraud and phishing easier. It's the patients who suffer when the hospital systems administrators put their own interests before the interests of patient privacy. It's casino websites that get hit by the DDoS attacks, not the consumer machines which are compromised and used in the botnet. So this is an example of security being used as an externality, an economic side effect, kind of like environmental pollution. So where you have an interaction that goes on, and the effect is onto a third party. Right. So we're also starting to see information security mechanisms used in new, interesting ways to protect business interests. This has started initially with printer cartridges. Xerox introduced a mechanism to authenticate the printer cartridges to the printer. So they had a business model where they subsidized printers, and so people are happy to buy the cheap printers, but then they get discouraged when they have to go pay 30 euros for a new printer cartridge. So people started to work around it. So what you have here is a system, a security mechanism whose sole design is to support a business model. There's the threat. There's not some nefarious attacker which is wanting to do this. It's someone trying to save a little money. And you're seeing accessory control spread to all sorts of industries. To the auto industry, cars are trying to start authenticating replacement parts, for example. And you have uses of digital rights management, which can influence the outcomes of markets. Apple has grabbed complete control of the music download industry, and until recently, they had their DRM, which meant that you could only use the songs you buy off iTunes onto the Apple encoded DRM standard, but they've since relinquished this only because the other music labels have realized that they're losing out because Apple has completely conquered the market this way. You have Microsoft, which is trying to control the distribution of high definition video content, and digital rights management mechanisms are enabling that. The general thing here is that there's this strong contradiction between the components of a network and the components of a system being distributed further and further out, and devices are becoming smarter and more capable. But the operators which provide these services want to retain control, so they're trying to retain control remotely. Why is it that we have such dominant firms in the software industry? Information industries are structured very different to your standard industry, your standard manufacturing industries. You have very high fixed costs and very low marginal costs, meaning you have to spend a lot of money paying your programmers to write the code in the first place, but once it's written, you can distribute it for virtually nothing. So the cost of each additional copy costs you very little. This leads to very competitive pricing where people try to sell closer and closer to the marginal cost, and the marginal cost in this case is zero. So you also have network effects where the value of a piece of software depends upon the user base. The more people which are using the software makes it more valuable to develop applications for it, for example. And so the company that gets in there first and sells the product for the cheapest gets the market share, and then once they're there, it's very hard to change. So Microsoft's initial philosophy of hurrying and pushing out their software, even when it was insecure, was quite reasonable for them to do this. And if they had waited and held off until they were already had all their ducks in a row and everything was secure, they would have lost out to someone else. They could afford to do that with Vista because they already were entrenched. The next thing you have to do in an information industry is you have to appeal to the vendors of complementary products. So if you're Microsoft, you're providing the operating system, you need to make it as easy as possible for the application developers to add third-party applications. In fact, the lack of security is another example of how Windows made it easier for the third-party vendors to develop software for its system. If you have very onerous and strict security checks on your APIs, then it's going to be harder for your third-party developers to provide the applications which make the software attractive. Let me now talk about sort of what I think one of the biggest problems that can be explained by economics, and that is the existence of asymmetric information, where you have one party has better information than the other party, which can lead to perverse outcomes. So there's this professor at Berkeley called George Akerlof, who won a Nobel Prize for describing this market for lemons, where he used the used car market as a metaphor for a market that has asymmetric information present in it. So basically, you're trying to buy a used car, but the buyers cannot easily determine the quality of the car that they're looking at. So they don't know if it's going to be a cherry, a very nice car, or a lemon, one that's got all sorts of problems. You see two cars, there's no easy way for a consumer to differentiate from one type of car to the next. So the sellers know this, okay? So the buyer is unwilling to pay a premium for the car, and the sellers, in turn, will not. So the market price drops down to the price for a cheaper car, for the poor quality car. And the sellers know this, so they only will be willing to sell their car if it is of poor quality. Because if you have a very nice used car and the market price is too low, you say, well, no, my car is very good and reliable. I'm not going to sell it for that price. So the same asymmetric information exists in the software market. You have security vendors who tout the security of their products. They market the security of their products, but it's often very difficult to ascertain as a consumer of these products whether or not one type of software is more secure than the other. All you have is marketing effectively right now. So buyers aren't going to pay a premium for something which claims to be more secure because in fact it could just be lies. And so the providers, the vendors themselves, will not actually even make secure software because they aren't financially rewarded for doing so. So in the end, you end up getting insecure software because that's what the market decides. So how can we reduce this particular type of information asymmetry? Well, one proposal has been to set up a market for vulnerabilities. So what you could do is you could establish a market price for a previously undisclosed vulnerability, and this provides a couple of features. One, it will provide more information about undisclosed vulnerabilities, but the price of it will inform the consumer as to which product is harder to get a zero-day exploit for. Because if the idea is you raise the price that you offer over time, and then hackers will only get interested once they're starting to get paid more and more money, and they make more and more effort. So once you receive so if you can compare your Microsoft, this version of Microsoft Windows has a market price of this versus this other type of this other software has this price, and you can very easily tell which one is more secure. Vulnerability markets to a certain extent do exist today. There are two companies that you have iDefense and Tipping Point, which are actively purchasing vulnerabilities, not quite in a market form. They don't publish the prices that they pay because it's in their interest not to. Because if everyone knows how much they're paying, then you have a competitive price and you have a competitive bidding process. But if you can instead just continue to pay lower prices, it works in their interest. But this may very well change. There's another company, Wabi Sabi Lobby, which has issued a lot of press releases, but their claim is that they are intending to actually publish an open vulnerability market where they list the prices. And if this were to happen, I think you would get a very clear delineation of the relative security of different pieces of software. So that's how you do it. That's one way to reduce the information asymmetry for software vulnerabilities. But a lot of the problems that are going on in the internet right now aren't necessarily down to just software vulnerabilities. You've got, spam, phishing, malware, all of this stuff. That's what the user's biggest problem is. Incentives matter here as well. So one example is that users don't necessarily know when they're dealing with a good website or a bad website. Everyone's got a website. It may have an SSL cert, so that means it's secure. What's the solution to this? Well, there are a number of third-party certification authorities which will issue you a certificate if you pass certain requirements. And you can proudly put the certificate on your website, and consumers can look at this and say, yes, I think this site is trustworthy or not. One example is, the biggest example is the Trustee certification scheme. Now, Trustee, as you probably know, it has very low requirements. The only thing it requires is that you have a privacy policy and that you publish it on your website. So this has nothing to do with the security of the website or whether or not its intentions are genuine or not. But they're setting the bar very low because they're trying to make money off of certifications. And there's been some research which has shown that these signaling devices using the Trustee certification is actually worse than ineffective. Bad companies are more likely to be certified than good companies with using Trustee. So he used data from SiteAdvisor, which tries to determine whether a site's issuing malware. He found that 5.5% of all Trustee certified sites were classified as bad, compared to just 2.5% of all sites that are found on the web. So if you come across something with a Trustee seal, you should definitely not take anything of use from it, okay? But it makes perfect sense, because if you've got a scam going, the first thing you want to do is you want to instill trust into the consumer. And so if you can buy it for a fairly cheap price, then why not do it? He also probably more controversially looked at search results on Google and compared the first 10 hits to the first 10 paid advertisements that come along the side. And he did it for certain keywords like screensaver, where you have notorious adware and malware that's often attached. And he found that the sites which had paid advertising were far more likely to be malicious than the sites which appeared naturally in the organic search results. And I think this is a problem. This is a problem for Google, and it's a problem for society, because what's happening is advertisers are are paying money to exploit users, and Google is profiting from it. So what are some of the solutions? You could require certification authorities to devote more resources to policing content. You could more controversially assign liability to the certification authorities. You could make Trustee liable if they grant the certification without proper vetting. Another thing you could do is you could require that the complaints against companies are also published. So right now, if someone has a Trustee seal, you click on it and it takes you to the Trustee website and says, yes, this is a Trustee certified site. But it only says good things about them there. But if you also require that complaints and ratings get disseminated as well, that could have a positive effect. So now, with my remaining time, I'm going to turn to some work that I've been doing looking at phishing attacks recently. So the first question is, I guess, how is phishing an economic problem? Why is it not just a technical problem? One is that you have these attackers who are carrying out the phishing attacks, and then you have a range of different entities which are responsible for defending against the attacks. You have banks, ISPs, which are hosting malicious sites, domain registrars, and each of these defenders are acting in their own strategic interest. And by acting in their own strategic interest, you sometimes can end up with suboptimal outcomes. Likewise, you have the effort that a defender that these banks take also suffers from informational asymmetries. Do you know how good your particular bank is in removing phishing sites as they appear? Do you know how good your ISP is at removing phishing sites and responding to requests to remove phishing sites? The information is not out there, and because of that, you end up getting a free riding effect. And finally, the most obvious reason why phishing is economic is that the losses have financial consequences, direct financial consequences. So our contribution is to first describe how one particular gang of phishing attackers, the Rockfish Gang, have acted in a very coordinated manner and to exploit the lack of coordination between the defenders. We've empirically measured the response times according to the type of phishing attack, the bank that's been impersonated, and where the hosting site is located. And finally, we come up with a first attempt at estimating the financial loss that's imposed due to phishing based purely on our empirical observations. So, very quickly, just let me describe the technical requirements for a phishing attack. Attackers send out spam impersonating banks with a link to the fake website. From the hosted fake site can be done in a couple of ways. It can be hosted on free web space. This is fairly common. It could be the most common way is for it to be instead located on a compromised machine somewhere, URL looking like that. And the third approach is just to register a domain that sort of looks like a bank name and then point it back to either one of these free web space or compromised machines. So that's the hosting side of it. And then, so once someone has given away their details to a phishing site, it has to be recovered by the attacker somehow. And this is done in two ways. First, it can be done by where the completed forms are automatically sent off to an email, to a email drop account, usually a Gmail or Yahoo webmail account. Alternatively, they could be stored in a text file on the spoof website itself, and they go back and retrieve them. So there are different ways to approach phishing. And a lot of the academic research, at least, is focused on sort of what are some proactive measures to try to make phishing impossible. Technical measures for that, web browser mechanisms for detecting fake sites, multi-factor authentication, all of this sort of thing. But what's actually going on now, today, even as we speak, is these reactive measures where banks get lists of phishing URLs that have been reported, and then they add them to a blacklist, which get disseminated out through the anti-phishing toolbars, and then the banks go after the hosting site. They send takedown requests to the ISP, which hosts it, and also, if it's a registered domain, to the registrar. So we collected, in fact, we still are collecting phishing reports from several sources, but the one I'll be talking about today is from this group called Fishtank, which is an open group that if you go to fishtank.com, they encourage, it's very Web 2.0. They encourage people to come and submit phishing reports, and then and even more than that, they allow people to vote on whether or not you think this is a phishing site or not. You get enough positive votes, then it is. And so that's how they verify the authenticity of the submissions. So we pulled the URLs from Fishtank, and then we went out and contacted these phishing sites repeatedly, twice an hour, until they stopped responding. Because we wanted to get an estimate of how long the sites were alive. Okay? So before I get into the details of the data results, I want to talk about how about a completely different type of phishing attack, and this is called from the Rockfish Gang. And they operate in a completely different manner to standard phishing attacks, and they're actually responsible for about half of all phishing, this one particular group. What they first do is they publish several innocuous-sounding domains, meaningless names, lofad.info. Doesn't look like a bank at all. Then they send out a phishing email with a URL that looks kind of like this, it'll give www.bankname dot a unique identifier dot dot, and then finally the domain all the way to the right, because people will look at this and they know to look to the left and they see, oh, there's my bank name, it seems legit. Okay, and so people click on that link, and then this domain itself, they control a name server which resolves this to a number of IP addresses, which are compromised servers, botnets basically, which only serve as proxies back to a central backend server, which actually hosts the phishing site itself. So you have the domain itself, which doesn't appear to have any phishing site on it. You have the compromised machines on the end users, which isn't hosting a phishing site. All it does is serves a proxy back to the actual host. And even more than that, what they do is each domain hosts impersonates a number of banks, at the same time. Usually around 25 different banks are impersonated for each domain. Okay? So depending upon the structure of the right-hand side of the URL, that will determine which bank you go to. So it's, fairly sophisticated. It's a lot more resilient to failure because you have this dynamic pool of domains, which maps onto an equally dynamic pool of IP addresses. So as one of the you contact the ISP, they remove the IP address, they clean it up, it automatically picks another one. And they have this constant pool of domains. They also increase the confusion because they're splitting the components of the attack over several different responsible authorities. You've got the registrar, like I said, who sees a domain, and then you've got the compromised machine owner, which not even hosting the site. And because they use this wildcard DNS, it completely confuses Fishtank and many of the phishing collators. They see 18,000 reports over 8 weeks, which is half of all of the reports, which just gets reduced down to only 400 unique domains. So what we traced over time is, this is over the period of 8 weeks. The red dots indicate how many unique Rockfish domains are alive on a given day, and the blue shows the number of IP addresses which appear to be operational and responsive. And the key thing here is that no matter what, it's always greater than 0. They always have some IPs operational. They always have domains operational. So you have the banks which are going after these domains, but by the time they get to them, there's already a new one operational. So they're making a lot of money, I believe. So then the next thing to look at was look at how many IP addresses are newly added each day versus how many get removed. And as you can see, there's a very strong correlation here, which this implies that there's automated replenishment. As an IP address gets cleaned up, another one automatically takes its place. It's a lot less coordinated when you look at the domains which are added each day. It's actually quite unsynchronized, which suggests that they actually manually replenish domains as they're removed. And also this here shows the number of domains versus number of IPs which are removed in a given day. And this is completely uncoordinated, which suggests that the response of the registrar and removing the domain and the response of the ISP is independent. They're not working together in any way that we can see. So let me go back to the data analysis of how long the sites stick around for. If you look at standard ordinary phishing sites, they last for an average of 60 hours with a median of around 20. But when you look at the Rockfish, they stick around for a lot longer, over a day longer on average, and a day and a half longer for the median. So they're being a lot more effective because their strategy isn't all that well understood by the people who are responsible for defending it. So the averages and medians are very misleading here. This is a histogram of the site lifetimes and number of days, And as you can see, it has a very heavy tail, or no, a very long tail. What you have is a lot of the sites get removed very quickly, but some of them just slip through the cracks and stick around for longer and longer and longer. We see phishing sites staying around for 8 weeks, 10 weeks. I mean, there are always sites which continue on. And this could happen for a number of reasons. This could be because the hosting ISP is just not cooperative. This could also just be because the bank is not aware of it. They've moved on to new ones. But regardless, what you have here is a very skewed distribution. In fact, I did some curve fitting, which shows that this actually follows a log normal distribution, which is a particular type of skewed distribution. So the main thing to take here is that you have a small but substantial number of sites which last for very long, which skew the performance of the response of the average case. So that's how long the sites stick around for. The next thing to consider is, okay, so who cares if a site is available if we don't know how many people are visiting it? And through a bit of a trick, we were able to count in a number of cases how many visitors a phishing website received. And I don't know if you're familiar with Webalizer, but it's one of the freely available web page statistics packages. And in fact, Webalizer is often exploited to host phishing sites as well. But it gives you a nice daily update of how many URLs, or how many visits you've had to each particular URL, how many unique visits. And so, fortunately, a lot of the times you will find that Webalizer is left in a world readable state. So anyone who goes to the URL can see the statistics. Okay, so what we started doing is every time we got a phishing URL, we went and looked to see whether or not it was running Webalizer and if it was world readable. And we found several hundred cases where it was so. And so we continued going back to get day-by-day snapshots of how many visitors have gone to the phishing URL. Kind of cool. That gave us an estimate of how many people were visiting the sites. But then we don't even know necessarily whether or not people are visiting the sites because they are giving away their details, or maybe they're just saying, die, spammer, die, we hate you, and this sort of thing. So to deal with that, we also found a number of cases where the user details were hosted on the phishing sites in text files, which were also world readable. And so we had about 400 phishing responses, and so we found that half of them appeared legitimate, and the other half clearly were not. So we can use that to combine with our Webalizer stats to give us a more accurate picture of how many of the visits are likely to be legitimate. So this is a day-by-day distribution of the number of unique responses. It kind of fluctuates a lot because of the data source, but you see some days, even all the way up to the 5th day, you can still have around 20 unique user responses to the phishing URL. And this is not just that you visited the phishing page URL. This is that you've gone through to the thank you page where you've actually filled in some details. So yes. So we know we've got an estimate of how many sites there are. We've got an estimate of how long they seem to stick around for. And we also have a separate estimate of about how many users tend to give away their details day by day. So we can sort of put it all together and come up with a very quick and dirty estimate of what the overall cost is to phishing. So we observed 1,438 websites and phishing websites in 8 weeks, which implies around 10,000 per annum. This, I believe, is a significant undercount, but we'll stick with it for now. We have 61 hours as the average lifetime, which using this graph implies around 30 victims per site. Gartner have done a study on identity theft. They surveyed the banks, asked how much money do you tend to lose to identity theft. It's not specific to phishing, but so the estimate is cost estimate's less than ideal, but it's all we have. They estimate that the banks actually end up losing around $572 per victim. They actually lose more than this. They lose around 1,700, I believe, but they recovered a lot of that, and only 542 they actually lose and never recover. So you multiply this together, you end up with $160 million for the estimated cost here. This does not include the Rockfish attacks, which I was just talking to you about, because it's hard. You have to count them differently because they have unique domains and this sort of thing. So, as a first pass, our best way of estimating them is that we know that the Rockfish account for 50% of all spam emails that are related to phishing. So, if we can use that as a proxy to suggest that they're getting about half of the phishing victims. So we can double our estimate and end up around $300 million lost per annum. So this is far less than the Gartner estimate, which estimates around $2 billion per annum just in the US alone. So I think a lot of this can be accounted for because we've very conservatively counted sites, and we've only counted what we've gotten from Fishtank. We've subsequently gotten other counts from different phishing feeds, and that suggests that the number of phishing sites is substantially more. The other explanation for it is that identity theft there are other causes of identity theft. It could be keyloggers, theft of the merchant databases, for example, losing 25 million records in the UK government, this sort of thing. So it's hard to separate out that. It would be nice if these surveys of banks actually got more specific to the particular means of monetary loss, because they often have this information, they just aren't sharing it. If we look more closely at the lifetimes of banks, we can see that there's actually very great variation. I already showed you that log normal distribution. Some sites stick around forever, some remove very quickly. If we then look at the performance of individual banks and of the ISPs which are hosting phishing sites, we see similar, very high variation. By publishing this kind of information, we can identify the exceptional performers, those who are very responsive to phishing attacks and removing sites, and those which are not. This shows the distribution of the number of phishing sites per brand. It's very skewed. PayPal, eBay, Bank of America are the highest targets, but then it continues on. There's a lot more sites which are impersonated a few times. This is the lifetime distribution. And sorry, the x-axis is impossible to read, but those are bank names. So you can see that the worst performer, which is Egg Bank, they have an average lifetime of around 180 hours. So that's about a week before they remove their phishing sites. And you might think, okay, that's all right. But then when you look, there are other banks which are doing a whole lot better. You have Flagstar, which gets its sites down in under 12 hours on average. So the performance could be improved. And I think one of the key things in reducing these information asymmetries is publishing good data which calls out this sort of thing and shows which bank is doing better. You have a question? Yeah.
Do you have data on how much each bank is spending to test this?
No, they keep this very closely guarded. What I do have information on is which banks are doing the takedowns themselves in-house, and which ones hire specialist takedown companies. We've gotten a couple of feeds from specialist companies whose sole business is taking down phishing sites, and they claim that there's a higher proportion of sites on the right-hand side which are paying these third-party providers versus the ones doing it in-house. And I've seen the data, and I agree that they seem to be right. But if you take that as a signal for spending money, because you probably have to spend more money if you're paying somebody else to do it. Connecting this to the investment is an open problem. So we also can look at particular ISPs, and we've done it for a large variation for all ISPs across the world, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'll just look at the ones which are hosted on free web space, and you can see there's great variation. Yahoo is by far the best of the free web hosting sites. Their median takedown time is just around 7 hours. Some of the other sites tend to be longer, but all in all, this is all better than the standard phishing sites, because it's a free host, so they don't mind cutting off their customer because they're not paying them. So I want to probably sort of conclude by talking about this final effect here, which is what we'we've tracked is a number of the domains which have been targeted by Rockfish attacks. You have on the top you have the .hk domain and the .cn domain, and this shows you the average site lifetime based upon the day in which it was reported. So on the left-hand side of the Hong Kong one, you'll see that there seems to be a whole lot of sites which lasted a very long time. This is at the beginning, whenever Hong Kong was first targeted by the Rockfish. And you can see that they kind of just left them there for a long time. And then finally, towards the end of March, early April, they got their act together and decided, okay, this is a problem we have to deal with. And they killed them all. And they continue to be targeted, but the takedown time is better. It's still not very good, though. It's between 100 and 200 hours. But it's certainly better than the 700 hours that you were seeing at the beginning. And so, likewise, you can see this with .cn. In May, they kind of moved over to .cn, and you had a very bad response at first, and then it got better. I don't have the graph for it, but shortly after Hong Kong was targeted in early April, the Rockfish Gang moved on to Austria, moved on to nick.at, and started registering tons of domains. And this actually caused a bit of a fuss, because .at was not responsive at all in removing the Rockfish domains. They cite legal reasons, because these are banks which are global and not Austrian brands. They did not have their legal department advice was that they could not actually remove the domains. And so they continued to hold this line for close to a month, and then Spam House, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, they issued a press release calling out nick.at by name and listing all of the live nick.at domains. And shortly thereafter, within a few days, the legal opinion changed, and now there aren't any more Rockfish domains on .at. But I'm not trying to blame .at for this, because rather what happens here, this is a fairly common thing. You have when a domain registrar is first targeted, they're not sure how to respond to it. They don't do anything for a while, and then they kind of decide, okay, yes, we have to do something about it, and they figure out what to do, and they start doing it. And you see this sort of clued up effect repeatedly. And what the attackers are doing is they're moving over from domain registrar to domain registrar, just exploiting the lack of coordination between registrars. And they'll continue to be able to do this so long as there are more registrars to choose from. But so we're dealing with an attacker which is quite adaptive. The Rockfish Gang have really benefited by cooperating and colluding together. They've come up with a system which impersonates many banks at one time, and it's quite resilient. And this probably should have actually attracted more attention from the banks themselves, because you've got 25 banks which are being hosted as an impersonator at a given time. But as it turns out, there is very little cooperation between the banks in removing the sites. I don't know. I think this could be because cooperation among defenders is hard, because you've got banks which have competing interests, and they might agree in principle that they should help, but they tend to focus on whenever they themselves are being targeted, which is actually completely understandable. I think with that I'll conclude. In my talk, I've just said that incentives explain the firm and end user behavior. You need to watch out for information security mechanisms being used as a tool to fight technological change. And I think measuring security incidents in a repeatable fashion is essential to mitigating problems and to providing better information about the threats that are out there, and reducing these informational asymmetries. Every year there's a workshop on the economics of information security. It's been in the US all except for 1 year, unfortunately. Next year it's in New Hampshire in the US. It's generally a quite good event. And there's my webpage. And then finally there's our security group publishes a blog which has lots of interesting little tidbits about all sorts of aspects of practical security. So with that, I thank you. Do we have time for questions or not? Yep.
At the beginning of your session, when you were talking about the options for a vulnerability marketplace, which is a fascinating concept, it brings to mind the fact that there are already controls in place in terms of common criteria certification or threat risk analyses where organizations try to determine if vulnerabilities are existing in their systems. Has any comparison been done to the efficacy of those types of controls and safeguards versus looking at a market?
So the question is, has there been an emphasis on other techniques for trying to assess companies' vulnerabilities? And you have common criteria as one example. I think the common criteria, which I'll pick on, is deeply flawed. It allows organizations to specify everything themselves. That they can say what the application is, they can say what the security requirements are, and they can build something that's compliant with the specifications technically, but is completely vulnerable to attack. It's happened time and time again. Common criteria certified devices have been exploited. It hasn't stopped anything. But as far as comparing the relative efficacy, I don't think anything systematic's been done, but that would be quite interesting. Yep.
As you mentioned the DKT case, being from DKT, I just want to clarify that some of the facts are not quite correct. The reason we had problems to react was not that non-Austrian banks have been involved. The reason was, as you mentioned, as the domain name is more or less completely senseless.
Yeah.
So our legal point was that we are happy to act if some trademarks or naming rights are infringed, but having a complete meaningless name would give us the position to charge the content of a web page, which is a very tricky position for an independent registry. Yeah. And worldwide, there are most of the registries, the 99%, do not handle the content of a website, despite there is some official position like in Finland or in Poland or in Switzerland, some advice from the police department, for instance, saying that yes, this is crime. So it's a best practice for a registry not to be judged to say what is crime and what is not crime. But I don't want to go too much into this, but I'm happy to talk to everybody who's interested in what.
No, I agree that that's strictly, that's correct. But I think what is interesting is that the attackers are exploiting this, because the procedure that registries are used to dealing with is, this is brand infringement, I can clear cut remove it. But now you've got this separation which is occurring, and so you've got so it's harder. It makes it harder for the registries to take the action, and so consequently they're slower in doing so, which is unfortunate. But I think it'll be hard to it's hard to change because it's hard to coordinate this sort of action globally.
Okay. Yes. You can ask one more question, but it should be very quick because we are losing time for the next speaker.
If you were thinking about law and regulation impact on security, having laws that make people more liable about data breaches, like where we have in California, for example, something like this.
Well, I think regulation is an inevitable part of this. I think just every other industry has been regulated. If you have the car industry as an example, you can't just put poorly designed cars on the road. They have to be certified. I think it's something we're inevitably moving to. One thing is we are actually doing a report. Ross Anderson, myself, Rainer Bohm from Dresden. We are writing a report for ANISA, the European Network and Information Security Agency, looking at incentive problems to information security, and what are some of the policy and potentially regulatory solutions which can be done. The report will be finished at the end of the year and probably be publicized in January, February. So you'll be able to get that from either our blog or there. So,
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you, Tyler.